How we doing today, guys? Today we're going to talk about a dozen deep dive rarities on the Impulse label. I think Impulse has a very misconceived notion in terms of the general public of what Impulse was. And the notion that it's all Albert Ayler, Archie Shepp, Pharoah Sanders, and John Coltrane, it's far from the reality of things. Those are the records that have seen demand in print, but there's a broad spectrum of music going on at Impulse, which is owned by ABC, a television and film company, make no mistake. Their market is white America, and Coltrane was probably more than they bargained for. They probably bit off more than they could chew, giving him that liberty, that license to blank canvas it. On many levels, thank God they did. And Coltrane opened the door for a lot of other guys, without question. But when Creed Taylor comes over from Bethlehem to ABC and convinces them to launch the Impulse series in 1959, in 1960 they put their first 4 records out simultaneously, and then they have a pretty steady diet of stuff throughout the 60s. And I have the first 150 titles completed, and plus another probably 50 or 60 more kind of randomly after that. It's a pretty wide swath of music, and they sprinkle in weird stuff and obscure stuff and poppy stuff from the beginning right through to the end, you know. And we're going to focus mostly on the first 150. We're going to start off with the great Jackie Paris. I'm a big Jackie Paris guy. He's somewhere between Mel Torme and Tony Bennett. He's definitely got a jazz sensibility to him. He's probably not as velvety quite as Mel, the Velvet Fog, but he's certainly in that ballpark. He's a guy from Nutley, New Jersey. That's Sopranos country right there. This is Impulse number A17. So this comes out probably 1960, maybe 61. Pretty early in the sequence. They start at number 1. And his uncle played with Paul Whiteman. I believe as a guitar player. He was in vaudeville, he was a tap dancer. So he's a real performer on a lot of different stages. He spent some time in World War II in the military, and then he was inspired by Nat King Cole to start his own trio, which is what he does. And he actually has a standing gig at the Onyx Club on 52nd Street in New York for a number of years. He's best known for a track by the name of Skylark, which I think is on the Brunswick label. He tours with Lionel Hampton and sings with him. He's invited to join Duke's group in probably 1951 or so. And he says he's too tired to go back on the road. There was a cavalcade concert of jazz at LA's Wrigley Field. And I know you say, isn't Wrigley Field in Chicago? LA did have a Wrigley Field of their own. That was for minor league baseball back in the 30s and 40s, and had a number of big events and venues happening in that stadium. He was the only vocalist to ever tour with Charlie Parker's quintet. And they never recorded together, but there are photos of them together, and that tells you something about this guy's ability right there. And he also worked with Mingus, and Mingus says that Jackie Paris was his favorite singer, and that's quite strange, because this guy's fairly saccharine compared to what most of Mingus's works are. But he's got a wonderful tonality, a real grasp of the center of the note. He doesn't seem to be seeking for the melody. He knows exactly where he wants to state each step of the chord. Just a great voice, you know, and that's really what separates Jackie Paris from the fold. It's just that beautiful tone. He also has a couple of records I want to show you real quick. This one's on Emercy, Jackie Paris 36095, probably from 1958. Tough to find. The Impulse one's tough to find. This one's impossible to come by. It took me a long time to find it. And then this one's on an Atlantic subsidiary, East West, from 1958 as well, the Jackie Paris Sound. And it's also outstanding. Italian-born American. I think his name was something Giacomo. I can't remember his full name. It was a great Italian name. But Jackie's a great singer, and he's rather unheralded by today's collectors. Of course, some of that could be dictated by demand, and some of that could be dictated by cost. His records don't come cheap. You know, it's tough to come by an old Jackie Paris record and pay less than 40, 50 bucks. And most of the time the Impulse one's near 100. The MRC one can go for big money. It's just pretty standard. This is number A53. And the album is called After the Lights Go Down Low and Much More by Freda Payne. I've been asked a couple times actually to try to be a little better showing album covers. So there we go. Freda Payne. After the Lights Go Down Low and Much More. A beautiful gatefold. It's actually a promo white label, which I had forgotten about. It's got that lovely Impulse gatefold. She's born in 1942 in Detroit, which makes her fairly young. She grew up listening to Ella and Billie Holiday. She does this kind of standard talent show, singing a few commercials. That's where a lot of these singers kind of work their way through. There's talent shows in high school, getting noticed, singing your church some, win a contest, join a group, and then find out where your talents take you. In 63, she moved to New York City, which is where they all end up. She plays with Quincy Jones, Pearl Bailey, and Bill Cosby of all people. Which I thought Bill Cosby mostly did comedy records, but I could see her having some vocal on some of that stuff. In 64, she's on an Impulse record with Manny Albam. Actually helps produce this, if I recall. Yeah, Manny Albam, who we're going to talk about next. He helps produce and arrange the tracks on this record. She does another record in 66 that's on MGM, which I don't have. She tours Europe in 65, records an album in Sweden. Then she kind of does a lot of Hollywood and acting and all that kind of stuff, as a lot of these gals are known to do. Then Dozier Holland, wrote a song for 1970 called Band of Gold. And it was a pretty high charting R&B song, and she's probably best known for that. But there's a cool group on this. I want to see who that alto player is. Nick Travis, Ernie Royal, Al DeRisi, Jimmy Nottingham, Al Ralph, Quentin Jackson, Bob Brookemeyer, Phil Woods. That's probably Phil Woods. Zoot Sims is also on this. Selden Powell on the tenor. Sol Schlinger on the baritone. Hank Jones on the piano. Of course, Hank was working with Impulse at this point. So let's move on to number A19. Manny Albam. Manny Albam was born in June of 1922. He's a saxophone player. He's mostly known as a composer, and an arranger, and a producer, and a music educator. He's a Dominican Republic native, but he's a New York City native as well. I think he lived most of his life in New York, if not the entire thing. I don't recall. He ends up doing stuff in Hollywood. And you hear him doing the Guns of the Navarone here. But he worked with Muggsy Spanier initially, the old Dixie player, as a teenager. He works with Georgie Old. He works with Bud Johnson. He learns how to arrange. And these are just a couple of guys who taught him. It said he has taut and witty bebop arrangements and colorful shading. He often uses flutes to lead the woodwinds in a lot of the arrangements and movements, which is kind of a trademark of his. One of his most popular works is a track called Samana, which was written for Stan Kenton. He also plays with Basie, Stan Getz, Bob Brookmeyer, Coleman Hawkins, Dizzy Gillespie, Freddie Hubbard, Hank Jones, Mel Lewis, Art Farmer, Irby Green. It's just a long list of just jazz royalty that he plays with and works for. He's doing stuff here from the films: Exodus, Paris Blues, La Dolce Vita, Guns of Navarone, The Green Leaves of Summer. So they're all kind of Hollywood tracks that he's giving his arrangement touch to. It's actually a really beautiful record, but it's also a far cry from Pharoah Sanders. This is a far cry from Ascension. This is music for white America to buy. Creed Taylor wants his records on white people's coffee tables. And when he doesn't quite get that at ABC Impulse, he goes on to Verve and tries again. And when he doesn't feel quite like Verve is what he needed, he went on to A&M and created CTI. Creed Taylor had a mission, and this was probably something that he envisioned for Impulse, not so much Kulu Se Mama. All to say, that being said, it's a great record. It's a fun listen, and if you grew up when I did in the 70s, these films were all on TV, and you were not really knowing them, but you catch a black and white, and you kind of watch it, and you watch the little car scene, and you take in that information, and as you get older, you kind of pine for those moments, and wish you'd written down what some of those old movies were that you saw on 100 Sunday afternoons. Pretty fun record. Now we're moving on to Lawrence Brown. And those of you who saw my series on the great trombone players probably a month and a half ago, probably in the 150 area episode-wise, I talk about Lawrence Brown. He's one of the 3 great bone players that played in Ellington's group over the years. And Lawrence Brown's just renowned for his creamy, beautiful tone, his beautiful, almost humming vibrato. It's gorgeous. He just has this beautiful way of playing the trombone that a lot of the other guys were playing more tricks and gimmicks and mutes, and he's just about stating melodic center, and Ellington used him a lot in compositions to be kind of the melodic guy, and his other players would do a lot of the other things. He was born in 1907, so that goes back, in Lawrence, Kansas. Lawrence Brown, born in Lawrence, Kansas. That's a little bit of a weird... They moved to Oakland in 1914, the outbreak of World War I. And so here they are, this young black family in Oakland, California. In 1932, he joins Ellington's group. And of course, that creamy tone, the vibrato, the range that he could play clean at, it's really unrivaled. He's one of the great players of all time. Him and Johnny Hodges have a very simpatico relationship, because Hodges is also creamy and dreamy, as we're hearing right now. And so, when Hodges left Ellington's group in 1951, Lawrence Brown went with him. And all that great Norgren, Clef, early Verve, Johnny Hodge stuff, it's all got Lawrence Brown on it. And they're just fantastic together. And it's just sad to me that today's record buyer doesn't give a fuck about Lawrence Brown or Johnny Hodges. His records sell for $6, $8, $10, $12. And Johnny Hodges is one of the great players of all time. He's just a beautiful alto player that, in the sense of like Lester Young, it's creamy melodic center and just gorgeous emoting, and he's telling you a story from his heart, and it's not being frilled. He's not adding all kinds of color to make you think the story is more remarkable than it is, because this story is good enough on its own. And he should be appreciated, Lawrence Brown, as should Johnny Hodges. He spent 6 years or so working as a CBS session studio guy, so he was getting at least paid to do that. In 1960, Lawrence Brown rejoins Duke Ellington for 10 years, till 1970, until he's like 70 years old, and then he retires from music permanently. But Lawrence Brown, people, I implore you, buy Lawrence Brown. He doesn't have a lot of records under his own name, but the Ellington stuff with Lawrence Brown and Hodges is great. But that Hodges stuff from early 50s on Clef, Norgren, and Verve reissues a lot of it. It's just beautiful. It's just beautiful. And it's jazz in the center, you know? It's jazz in the center. Next guy we're going to talk about, George Wein. And you say to me, George Wein, ain't that a concert promoter? And I would say yes. George Wein is a concert promoter, but he also is a many-storied guy with a wide faculty of skill sets. And Mr. George Wein starts off in Boston. He's born, I gotta flip my page here, sorry. He's born like 1907. No, sorry, 1925 it looks like. He's still alive. 25, 75, so he's gotta be 90 years old. That's just insane. But he's known for being a concert promoter, Newport Jazz Festival primarily, but he was also a pianist, and he's also one of the great impresarios in jazz. He arranges and funded a lot of the great concerts in jazz. He ends up funding the Playboy Jazz Festival in Los Angeles. He ends up being a large part of the Newport Folk Festival, which we're going to come back to later in this same episode. But the Newport Jazz Festival was absolutely the great jazz festival, the first outdoor jazz festival in America. In 1954, Louis and Elaine Lorillard come up to him and ask him to organize a festival in their hometown of Newport, Rhode Island. And he gets behind it, starts arranging it, and he eventually takes over the reins to it, and it becomes one of the most successful jazz festivals of all time. I think there's a few years where it's not happening, but it's around for a long, and it's back now, of course. 2020, other things have happened. So in 2020 there is no Newport anything. But he also was the guy who first initiated corporate sponsorship behind these events. So when Schlitz Beer got behind his event, it allowed him to have deeper pockets in his own and spread that risk around. He was no idiot. He's a Boston guy, like I mentioned, and he also founded the Storyville Club, that a lot of famous jazz records in the 50s are recorded at Storyville. And he starts the Storyville label, and this is a 10-inch of Serge Chaloff, of the Boston baritone player, on the Storyville label. Probably 1953 or 54, pretty early stuff. But it's a cool label, cool logo, not a huge discography from my understanding, but Wein has his fingers in a lot of fires. But he's also a piano player, and he has a record of Bethlehem as well, where he's leading a group. I think his wife plays with him on some of it. But this is a fine record, and it's enjoyable. And he's playing, of course, with the Newport All-Stars, Pee Wee Russell, Ruby Braff, Marshall Richard Brown, Lawrence Freeman, George Thorogood Wein. Anyway, so that's George Wein. And that's a clear-cut example of some of the strange outskirts of Impulse. Now, another interesting record that is hard to even have a comparable piece to is this Gordon Jenkins presents My Wife the Blues Singer, Beverly Jenkins. And she's got a fine voice. I think she lacks some of the requirements of the blues. I'm not sure she struggled quite enough to know the blues firsthand. But Gordon Jenkins was in the industry for a long time. He records and arranges stuff for Frank Sinatra, for Nat King Cole, the Andrews Sisters, Johnny Cash, Louis Armstrong, Peggy Lee, Ella, and Billy. So he's doing arrangements for a lot of very important people in the business. He has an initial wife, has 3 kids with her, but then he ends up having a second wife from one of the singers in his band. And this would be her, Beverly Jenkins. And so you know she's a singer from the get-go. She's singing backup in his group. So she's obviously got a skill set. And she holds down the blues fairly well. But all the same, when most people reach for a blues record, they rarely are going to reach for that. It's an interesting listen. And it fits squarely in the Orange and Black discography at A44, so probably 1963, absolutely 63. A rather obscure band on here: Mo Schneider, Jack Sperling, Matty Matlock, Eddie Miller, and Al Hendrickson. And I can tell you with all honesty, I don't know any of those names or faces. So I'd have to guess that some of these guys are Capitol studio players that play on some of the Nat Cole and Sinatra stuff. And he's relying on these guys that he knows to make these arrangements for his wife to sing on. It's great stuff. Absolutely great stuff. And an interesting chapter, of course, in the history of the Impulse label. Now, one of the strangest records on Impulse, and as a young kid collecting, I would see this a lot in record stores and not really know what to make of it. And that's this album by the Russian Jazz Quartet. And it's got Boris Mindy and Igor Baruchtis. Igor Baruchtis. There we go. With Boris Mindy. Roger Kellaway, of course, is that cat right there. And that's Grady Tate, the brother on the drums. But these two brothers here, not brothers, these two white dudes, are Russian Soviet-era defectors. And we're going to talk about the Cold War twice in this episode, interestingly enough. It seems a little orchestrated to me by the powers that be. This guy, these two are big parts of the Russian Music Hall Orchestra. The orchestra is on tour. They defect to the American Embassy in Tokyo. They end up seeking asylum to go through Copenhagen, into West Germany, into New York City, into jazz. And I gotta think somehow there was powers and forces that be that wanted this defection to happen, to Americanize two Russian patriots with this American music, a triumph for capitalism, if, as it were. It played very poorly in Moscow, from my understanding, and they disappear off the scene after this one record, and they're playing chamber music in Russia, and they're fine. He's a fine sax player, and the bass player is just fine, but it seems like there's a political, economic machine at work here on some level. There's some publicity going on saying, you know what, let's get these guys out to the West. And then, once we're done using them, let's forget about them. I wasn't there at the time, but the Cold War shaped a lot, if not everything, that was happening in those days. So, I think most defections, there's some phone calls made from the West to said individuals, offering them incentives to do so. But, again, let's not get too political right now. I love this record. I think it's fantastic. Lambert, Hendricks, and Ross. I think that goes here. David Lambert, John Hendricks, and Annie Ross. All three of them had kind of careers of their own, but they collaborate together from 58 to 62 or so, and Annie Ross leaves. They do this record on the ABC label that put them together called Sing a Song of Basie, and it's very successful. It's actually since been added to the Jazz Hall of Fame, Lifetime Grammy Award, 1998 they won it. But it's vocalese. They're singing the parts with their mouths. But it's all vocalese. It's not horns. And this record was so successful that even Count Basie goes, let's do it. Why don't you guys make a record with me? And they continue to make a record with Basie on his label, Roulette. That's pretty outstanding as well. And then, as Impulse is coming into its own, which, remember, is affiliated with ABC, at A83 they reissue this same record. So these are the same records. And they do this with a Billy Taylor record. They do it with a couple other records where they take an ABC issue, jazz record, and they'll reissue it on the Impulse label. But that being said, this is a fun record. So you hear all these sections being played by vocalists. And by the way, John Hendricks in the great Ken Burns jazz documentary is a wonderful orator. I enjoyed listening to him speak very much throughout that series. So here's another really weird record on Impulse. Al Jazzbo Collins, number 150. So we're going to be probably 1967 at this point. And Al Jazzbo Collins was a radio disc jockey. He fills in at the University of Miami, I think it was. He fills in and ends up realizing this is something he wanted to do. And so he ends up spending his lifetime, for the most part, as a radio DJ, personality. He hosted The Tonight Show briefly for 5 weeks back in '57. He's a Rochester, New York native. And what's fun about Al Jazzbo Collins is he's kind of a beatnik storyteller in a jazz sense. He's kind of just freewheeling it. He's a character. He has a couple of show-ups out in Bethlehem where he's kind of emceeing jazz concerts at Bethlehem Issue. He's a comedy. He's got a mouthful of jokes and witty humor, and he was a huge jazz enthusiast. He plays a lot with Steve Allen, very interwoven in the fabric of the white culture in America at that point. And so he was just kind of this beatnik radio DJ guy, and Impulse gives him a record. A lovely bunch of Al Jazzbo Collins on the Jazz Banditos. And Terry Gibbs is on it, microphone player, Hal Blaine on the drums, Mel Brown on the guitar, Ron Brown is on the Fender bass, Steve Allen and Paul Humphrey. And it's kind of what it is.
Now I'm saving up some bread to get some extra equipment for it.
It's hip stuff. So you see Impulse is cutting a pretty wide range of stuff here. It's somewhat comparable to the Word Jazz records by that Ken Nordine fellow. For those of you who don't know, those are interesting records as well. Kind of a spoken word jazz expression, and he's using the spoken word in a kind of free-flowing jazz sensibility. A record I've talked about once or twice before, but it's clearly one of the rarest Impulse records, is this Danny Richmond record. And the record's a cool record, but more than anything else, fantastic cover, by the way. Got the Impulse spine, if you can see that. There's Danny Richmond. And Danny Richmond was born in 1931 in New York City. He's mostly renowned for being a drummer for Charles Mingus for 20 years. And he's a big part of the Mingus sound. He takes over the Mingus Dynasty Band when Mingus passes. Him and Mingus were very close friends. And so that tells you something about this guy. This guy had a certain amount of ability to handle Mingus and probably control Mingus and deflect Mingus. Because Mingus was an asshole. Let's not mince words. Mingus was an asshole. And most guys couldn't stand 6 weeks, 6 months with the guy. This guy spent 20 years with him. And from what I've read, Mingus confided in him, and they were dear friends. And every asshole needs a dog. Every asshole needs something he can love to compensate for all the times he's an asshole to everybody else. And he probably had Charlie's ear. Danny could probably tell him when he was being an asshole, and Mingus would probably listen. You know, so Richmond has a huge role in the Mingus discography and history. He also records with Joe Cocker, kind of weird. Mark Almond, much weirder. Elton John, marginally weird. He plays on this album with Toots Thielman on guitar and harmonica, who we just talked about in that Riverside episode. Jackie Byard's on the piano. Jimmy Rainey plays guitar on a lot of it. Cecil McBee, and then Willie Bobo, that Latin percussion, all with Danny Richmond playing around him. It's an interesting record. And like I said, I could count on one hand the number of times I've seen this LP. It's as rare an Impulse record as there is. And it's a fun piece. It's not musical genius by any stretch, but it's a fun piece. And that leads me to number 2 on my list of interesting, rare Impulse titles, and that's Gloria Coleman Quartet. Love Jimmy Rainey. This Gloria Coleman record is also a white label promo. And for those of you who don't know what that is, a white label promo it means on this is almost every label, the center logo is going to be white, meaning it's the very first test pressing that went out to radio stations to promote the record before it was actually released. White label promo. And they're desired by a lot of collectors. The template that presses a record is never going to sound more pristine than on those very first test pressings. Whether or not there's actually an audible difference between a white label promo and a second, third pressing, some audiophile guys might be able to tell you more about that. I've heard there is, but I don't know. She's an interesting piano player, organ player. She actually started playing bass, moves to the piano and the organ. There's not a lot of information about her. She, good-looking gal. She plays with a gal by the name of Paula Roberts, and I think Paula is the drummer. Yep, she is. So that's actually Gloria, and that's Paula Roberts. And then Leo Wright, the fantastic tenor and baritone player, is playing on this. And then, what do you know? Grant Green on Impulse. I can't think of another Grant Green Impulse record. I might be mistaken, but I can't think of one. This is A47. Gloria Coleman ends up becoming quite a writer. Actually, Rudy Van Gelder was in charge of this record. She actually writes songs for the likes of Bobby Humphrey, who writes some great fusion pop, disco, jazz stuff in the late 70s that I like a lot because it's great to play at a club. If people are kind of walking in, there's some Bobby Humphrey songs. You make me feel so good. That's fantastic stuff. If you don't know that, type it up on your computer and just listen to how that. Oh, it's great stuff. Ernestine Anderson is another gal that she does some writing for. Gloria Coleman, Soul Sisters featuring Paula Roberts. Weird, interesting. Grant Green, right there. There's Grant on Impulse. Who knew? So you can see Impulse continues to cut a wide swath. And now we're down to number 1. And number 1 is going to be a two-headed monster. And weirdly enough, if you can see that, Impulse has 2 records that don't have the orange on the spine, they have blue on the spine. Only 2. They come back to back, A24, A25. Alarums and Excursions by Michael Brown, and Morality by Oscar Brand. And I want to dive into both of them real quickly for different reasons. The Michael Brown record is interesting. It's from 1963. He's born in 1920. He's a composer, a lyricist, a writer, a director, a producer, and a performer. So he's got a pretty wide swath of the music industry that he's around. And it looks like Impulse, part of what they're doing is giving the George Weins and the Manny Albams, and a lot of these guys who have a long time being producers and arrangers, are giving them albums of their own. And Michael Brown is an interesting fellow. He's from Mexia, Texas. He played in the New York Cabaret for a long time. In '64 at the World's Fair, the DuPont Pavilion, well, I'm not a big fan of DuPont, had this wonderful World of Chemistry piece of music that he wrote. And they performed it 48 times a day with 2 complete stages, with 2 complete groups. And he's an interesting fella. Bob Thiel's producing this, Van Gelder's engineering it, and he's singing folky, socially conscious, the John Birch Society, Elizabeth Borden. There's some stuff talking about the communists and the rise of socialism, and folk music often kind of tackled the issues of communism versus capitalism. And so this is an interesting record for social political context. It's just a weird one-off on Impulse in the main Impulse sequence, 824. Long way from Archie Shepp. And then Oscar Brand. This is an interesting record as well. He's a folk singer, born in Winnipeg, Manitoba, a city I lived in or near for 7-8 years while I was a teenager. And Winnipeg is a cold Moscow. It's a cold, cold city. And this is somewhat spoken word. There's some guitar playing on it. He's talking about a lot of political issues. Spent my money on Sally Brown. Talking morality blues. Rye Whiskey, the Old Traveler's Song. Billy the Kid. He was born February 7, 1920. He sings and writes for 70 years. In 1927, his family moves to Minneapolis. Then they move to Chicago, then he eventually ends up in New York. He starts a radio show in New York at WNYC, where he hosts this folk radio station for 70 years. And it's still a world record for the longest time anybody's hosted a show on radio. He introduced to the world Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, Pete Seeger, the Kingston Trio, Woody Guthrie, Arlo Guthrie, Joni Mitchell, Peter, Paul and Mary, Hoddy Ledbetter. These are all people he helps bring to the attention of the world. And he also, in a very interesting stroke, in order to prevent censorship of his radio program, refused to be paid from WNYC for 70 years. You're not gonna censor what I play. You're not gonna tell me what we can and can't play. And so he refused to take pay from the radio. He was one of the first people to be accused of communism when they started doing the Red Scare investigations of artists and musicians and movie stars. He was never a communist. He was very anti-Stalin, actually, but he still sympathized with the people who aren't getting red listed and said it's their right to sing what they feel. And that didn't sit well with the Red Scare people. You know what I'm saying? They don't want to hear that kind of talk. But his songs can go from novelty to Canadian and even American folk anthems. This Land Is Your Land, he wrote that as a Canadian national song. Not an anthem, but a national song. He has some very strong social commentary on a lot of his records. He's just a very important, he plays next to on stage guys like Leadbelly, Woody Guthrie, Josh White, Pete Seeger. So he was in the folk circle a long time. It kind of makes me think of A Mighty Wind, which I don't want to make light of this guy, but that movie's hilarious. But he's an important figure in folk. Impulse gave him this stage to put this music out there. And it's interesting how in the 60s, communism is such a common theme already. Between the Russian Jazz Quartet, between this Oscar Brand record, the Michael Brown record, there's just a lot of discourse on the course of the planet post-World War II. And that sure beats what we have today, where we have no discussion. But the bosses get to make the rules, they get to tell us what we can read, and they get to tell us what we can watch. And so somehow we've all been convinced by the richest of the rich that the idea of wealth sharing isn't a good idea. And maybe they're not the most neutral of commentators. Let's just remember that the ideas of socialism and communism strip away from the elite their wealth, not from the masses. But somehow those rich people have convinced us that freedom means that you can someday kill enough people to be as rich as me. And we spent centuries accumulating this wealth through genocide, slavery, and all kinds of horrific things. We're not about to give this money back to some ideology that wants to share it so everybody can have health care. Are you kidding me? Freedom! I want my rights. I want the right to go invade a sovereign people, destroy their nation, take their resources, because that's what freedom is. But they write the textbooks. They televise the shows. They tell you what the news is. And again, just think about that for a second. The ones who stand the most to lose are the ones who are telling us that it shouldn't be done. Maybe we're not very cognizant of who our masters are. But if you study history enough and you watch the ascension of the capitalists and how this new ideology comes along that wants to change things and how staunchly the resistance has been to that idea of let's share this wealth, the wealth that shouldn't really belong to you anyway because all you did was kill more people for it, because you had the biggest guns and the deepest pockets, that entitles you to be the richest motherfuckers on the planet? That's what freedom is? It's sad. We've lost, man. It's over. Greed is not the principle that should govern our lives. Greed and morality run opposite directions. And so how can freedom be the freedom to kill without any justice because I am entitled to it? And some hippie commie with some ideology say, you know what? Maybe the world's wealth should belong to its people to provide education and health care. That's galling to them. Appalling. No! We just went through centuries of slavery and genocide and world wars to make these pockets deep like they are. What did you guys do to earn it? Just being born on planet Earth makes you deserve something? We've killed millions, billions for this money. You think we're going to share it? So we've been convinced what freedom is. And socialism and communism, for my mind, has never really been given a chance to succeed. And I'm not saying those systems are perfect, but ideologically, they make sense to a 5, 10-year-old per kid. Let's share. Maybe it'll be better for everybody, and there'll be less crime and desperation and poverty and starvation. War won't be such a necessity if people can all survive. But it doesn't make sense to us grown folk because we've been trained our whole life. That's about laziness. And no, it's about taking your money, rich guy. The money you kill for, and you enslave for, and commit a genocide for. The money you pump arms around the world to continue to protect your economic interests. You're the only one who stands to lose dramatically from a strong socialist, central powerful government. And so you convinced all the citizens of your republic that freedom is no government. Government's dangerous. They hate you. Government ain't the enemy. Government's our ally. Government's the one that we can express our voice through, and we continue to castrate those motherfuckers. And they keep us divided in this left and right camp. Both sides thinking the other one's got the wool pulled over their eyes when we're both puppets on strings. We both dancing for massa. Going to work, paying our debts, thinking we're doing something called freedom. In the 1960s, at least you could talk about that. Today, ain't no conversation. But you can buy yourself a new car, limited warranty, but we're going to guarantee good payments. That's what you're free to be. You're free to be in debt for the rest of your life. Not educated, not spiritually enlightened, not even happy. And again, I said before, unless you know the difference between what you want and what you need, capitalism will own you and you'll never be happy. Know what you want, love what you need, and the few things you want, get them when they come along. But if you don't know the difference, you're going to think you need everything, and none of it will make you happy. Happiness is not ever going to be on that road. Happiness is inside. It's us here. It's our commitments, how we feel about ourselves, how honest, how trustful, how loyal are we. That's where happiness comes from. Keeping our promises. Supporting those who need help. And even a lot of the liberals out there are full of shit baloney motherfuckers, man. Talking about their empathy and caring about people. What are you doing? You know? My wife came to liberalism because she never defined it verbally, word-wise. But she does more than most of these far left-wing liberals ever do, working with the homeless community, advocating for them. Caring about people. That's ultimately what it comes down to. Caring about other people. And capitalism says, you know what? You just let it on Boardwalk. You owe me rent. I got 3 hotels, 14 houses, and you got a car payment, motherfucker. You're due. You're overdue. Music used to debate and talk about these things, and they got in trouble for it. But there ain't even a discussion nowadays. Jazz used to be at the forefront, the cutting edge of the social movement, of advocacy, of speaking for those without a voice. And I don't hear a whole lot of that in music today at all. You know who maybe does that? Rage Against the Machine. And they got silenced after 2000 because someone must have put the hammer on them. But those guys had things to say. They knew what they were angry about. So anyway, I hate to get too political, but sometimes I gotta speak from my heart. And you hear in the 60s on Impulse, in 12 records, communism came up 3 or 4 different times. And it just shows you how much of a part of the times it was in those days. And I'm just advocating for all of us. Because when you have a humility about who you are as a human, you realize that what you're entitled to all should be. Regardless of nation, regardless of race, regardless of religion, we all deserve health care. We all deserve a good education. We all deserve to understand our interconnectedness as humans on this little blue marble flying through space. We can't be at each other's throats and be successful. We can't be divided and be a people. We've seen our planet from space. Mount Kilimanjaro is your heritage. The Kiwi, the Maori in New Zealand, that's your heritage. The Great Wall of China, the Pyramids of Egypt, Mesopotamia, that's my heritage. Planet Earth. This is the club we belong to. And until we get back to a unified understanding through education of our interconnectedness, and that this is one migrating family of humans, regardless of race and shade, regardless of which way you pray, you're all praying to the same creator, and none of us know his name. So maybe we should just all kind of shake hands and say, you know what? We all don't know. How naive can I be to think that I'm right and everybody else is wrong? Let's assume that we're all fucking wrong. And that there's a new definition of what right should be. A united humankind that doesn't need to rely on war and hate and fear. That shares economics and supports those without support and takes care of the mentally ill and the handicapped. The way we treat our lesser than society today is still deplorable. Here in America, the options that are there for people with mental illness, my wife works in that field, it's tragic. And she sees what's happening in Canada and Europe and other places, and there's so much more opportunity for those people in those nations to get help. And here, the poor, the ill, the minorities, all slip through the cracks to become the ones that the poor middle class could point down at and say, I got it better than them. Yay for freedom. I'm out.